Spanning the Neolithic period, which extended from about 10,000 BC to about 4,000 BC, and the Bronze Age, traditionally dated between 3,300 and 1,200 BC, Jericho preserves a unique moment in the development of cities. It is, in fact, the earliest discovered walled city in human history. Its massive Neolithic ditch, wall, and tower were built by the first community on the site and used by later groups as well. This is the first large-scale communal urban labor known in history, and it may have been among the first such massive works involving cooperative labor ever. Now, the use of cooperative labor on a scale larger than a kinship group, that is a clan or extended family, is a defining feature of the ancient city. In the Jordan Valley, Jericho sits between Mount Nebo on the east and the Central Mountains on the west. The Dead Sea lies to the south. Jericho only was able to thrive in this desert due to natural irrigation from underground tributaries that flowed from the Central Mountains to the Jordan River 4 miles to the west. These fed the oasis that allowed Jericho to flourish. Notably, another feature of success, arguably the most important one, is Jericho's elevation. At about 800 feet, about 245 meters below sea level, it's one of the lowest cities in the world and close to the critical water table. This feature made agriculture and the domestication of animals possible here, probably earlier than any other area in the region. It was vital to the foundation and growth of the early city. Now, Jericho's position in the landscape meant that it was at something of a regional crossroads, along trade routes perhaps dating back even as early as the beginning of the Neolithic. Cities to the south, including Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and to the north, such as Bethshan and Nazareth, were within easy reach of Jericho, and given its oasis, it was a natural stopping place between all of them. Furthermore, the mountains to the east and west, natural defenses that rose over about a mile in height, also screened the city from invasion from those directions. So its natural resources, position, and defense made it a key to controlling this entire region and a focus for trade. Excavators, for example, found a number of obsidian blades at the site. This volcanic glass was prized as a material to make sharp blades. In fact, it makes blades that can be sharper and thinner than even steel. There's this fun story about an anthropologist, I don't know if it's true or not, who was about to undergo surgery, and he insisted that the surgeon use obsidian rather than steel blades because he knew that they were sharper and he would heal more quickly. Well, in the Neolithic, of course, there was no metal to pick from, so this took on a particularly critical role. The obsidian found at Jericho came from central and eastern Anatolia, that is, modern Turkey, so it provides some evidence of the distant trade that came into the city. Now, Jericho is on a site referred to as a tell, meaning mound. The mound is the result of millennia of mud brick architecture that collapsed and was leveled, and the new buildings are built right on top of that old ruined layer. Gradually, then, occupation layers built up, and the mound formed. This tell was almost continually occupied from before 9,000 BC to about 1,580 BC, according to the excavator of the site in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon. Now, Kathleen Kenyon was one of the pioneers of biblical archaeology. She was also an early proponent of stratigraphic excavation, noting changes in soil layers as she dug and the date changes that those represented. This is critical in archaeology to get a sequence of, for example, the occupation of a city. And it sets her apart from earlier excavators who just went through entire cities with effectively a bulldozer. Now, recent work on the site dates the end of occupation down, that is, later, to about 1400 BC from about the 1580 that Kathleen thought it was. There's also a 4-meter thick deposit of undated material that no pottery, no dates, from prior to 9000 BC. So the presumed foundation date of the city is about 9400 BC. Radiocarbon tests on material from the site date the earliest phases of large-scale construction in Jericho to the period from about 8500 to 7370 BC. Even at this early date, the city sprawled over almost 10-acre area, or about 425,000 square feet, with a large stone wall and a ditch surrounding the entire city. At least one large, round stone tower was built as well. Agriculture, including grains such as wheat and barley, as well as peas and beans, is found. The remains of gazelle, cattle, boar, and sheep and goat have been found from these Neolithic phases also. The animals may have been domesticated, but the evidence is scanty. Typically, we expect sheep and goats to be domesticated first, followed by pigs and cattle. But of course, Jericho may not be typical. It's the earliest, so it may not fit that model. We also have a problem about this being the earliest phase of domesticated plants and animals, because animals and plants change over time. They adapt to domestication. So in the earliest phases, we can't tell them apart. We don't know the earliest phases of domestic animals. We can't tell their skeletons from wild animals. We also, you may have noticed, I use sheep and goats together as though they're inseparable, because they are effectively in the archaeological record. We can't tell sheep bones from goat bones, and so we always just say sheep and goats. Now, that round tower at Jericho, it's all conventionally referred to as the Watchtower, is one of mankind's earliest works of stone, and it seems to be completely unprecedented in scale or design. There's nothing like it before or for a very long time after in the history of cities or any human architecture. It stands about 28 feet, or about 8.5 meters in height, and about 30 feet, or 9 meters in diameter at the base. The walls are about 5 feet, or 1.5 meters thick. But it's not a solid mass. The interior of the tower contains a staircase of 22 steps leading up to the roof. First tower, first interior staircase as well. It's a lot of firsts here. Now, when it was discovered, it was immediately associated with the story of Joshua, but later excavations demonstrated that the date was wrong, as it was too early. Current thinking is split regarding the use of the tower. It seems unconnected, both literally and figuratively, to the defensive works of the Neolithic city, which included the ditch and a wall about 6 feet wide at the base and about 13 feet, or 4 meters tall. These defensive works, by the way, may have been designed to defend more against the unpredictable flash flooding that occurred from the runoff of powerful storms rather than enemies. If you live in a mud house, flooding is an enemy. The tower, however, could have a religious rather than a military purpose, being a watchtower, or we would refer to it as an observatory. Now, once again, there are no contemporary sites to compare, but there are Bronze Age and later sites that provide parallels for this sort of use. Many early religions, particularly in this area of Southwest Asia, emphasize the worship of the sun or of a sky god. In a number of places, that worship also involved careful and accurate observations of the movements of the sun and the stars. To facilitate that, or those observations, and also to be physically closer to the deities, the shrines and sanctuaries of these deities would be often built on raised platforms, almost invariably with an open space in front of any temple to commune directly with the sky. This raises the question of who's doing the communing. Who is it who is raising themselves up to effectively be the intermediary between those down below in the community and the God above? We think that these were probably what we refer to as priest kings, that is, adult male figures in the community who had both religious and civic functions. That is, they're the heads of the religion as well as the heads of the community. And I think this is interesting because it links us back to Çatalhöyük, where we postulate priest kings were in charge of the neighborhood shrines. It also has parallels in, younger cities such as Uruk. We'll discuss the needs of the elevated ritual space later in the Sumerian city of Uruk, where the sky gods were very prominent. Later in the historic period, Even the Romans utilized such raised platforms for their augurs. Augurs are these these people who you went to find out the will of the gods, to ask what's going to happen. And they would read the will of the gods in the flights of birds. So they would build their largest and most important temples and these open spaces for augury in Rome on the Capitoline Hill, placing them also on a large podium. There's always the old joke that when you don't know what something is in archaeology, you can say it has ritual significance. And that sort of seems like the case here. We've decided that this has ritual significance. But that, of course, doesn't really satisfy anyone. We want actual evidence. The problem is that with the watchtower, this large observatory or platform at Jericho, there is no other evidence. There are no burials found under it, so it's not a tomb marker. There's no pottery from this early phase. And it's difficult to conceive of what, other than religion, would drive a group of people to dedicate what was probably about 11,000 days of labor to construct the tower, the first building of its kind in the history of the world. Whatever its purpose, its existence implies a highly structured society, most likely with a strong central authority to direct such labor, and as I said, probably an authority that had a shared religious and civic function. I should probably explain just how much labor 11,000 days actually is. That's not a measure we're, I think, used to seeing in terms of measuring labor. 11,000 days of labor was what was required to create or construct the tower. If you divide that out, that comes out to a year's work for about 38 men. But really, that's just in the construction. It does not include quarrying stone, bringing it up here, or anything associated with that, building scaffolding or anything. That's just the labor to put the stone tower together. So what we really have is a tower that we think was worked on by many more than 38 people, probably over a space of several months. So we should think of a significant proportion of the labor in the community turned towards this construction project. Now, the people in the community lived in round, sun-dried mud brick houses. These are found at the Neolithic level at Jericho. They're about 14 feet or 4.3 meters in diameter with sunken mud plaster floors. Each is pretty much identical. Each has its own grain storage area, but there seem to be, interestingly enough, no social distinctions or specializations yet. All of the houses are comparable to one another. The round houses were scattered within the community with no discernible pattern. They may also illustrate the power of families as urban units, because we believe that they were clustered by kinship groups. Let me unpack what that means when I describe those components of the round houses for just a minute. First off, the organization. If in fact they're scattered throughout the community, there's no central organizational structure to it. If they're in fact grouped by a loose configuration of family groups, that indicates that the overall organization of the community is by extended family, which could mean that Jericho actually is settled by groups of extended families who maintain those connections. That's very different than the identities we find in later cities, where in fact somebody's profession, for example, gives them their primary identity. The fact that all of the houses are almost exactly the same size tells us that there's no social structure. There's no differentiation between those at the lowest and highest levels. Everybody has the same size dwelling. And that each house had a grain storage area may seem like a rather banal fact to us, but it's of critical importance for understanding the society here, because what it means is that each, not just extended family, but immediate family, each house themselves has control over their own food. Quite possibly, it means that they're also independent in terms of food production. They may have their own fields, they may have their own flocks. And that also is a remarkable distinction from many of the houses and the cities that we're going to take a look at in places like Uruk and Mohenjo-Daro. Uruk in particular, I think, is a very good contrast because it's in the region in Mesopotamia, but had very deliberate central control. The food storage areas are, in fact, in religious structures, not in the houses. Now, that being said, I have to admit that we know very little about the Neolithic period people here at Jericho. We don't know their ethnicity. We don't know where they came from. There's, of course, no writing yet, because writing doesn't come around until about 3000 BC. And we can't distinguish the people at Jericho culturally, that is, in their culture, their house shape, and so on, from anyone around them. So we really don't know who they are culturally or ethnically, and what sets them apart from their neighbors, only that they chose to live here and build this remarkable city. In the later Neolithic levels, with radiocarbon dates from about 7300 to about 6000 BC, Jericho grew to a city of about 2,000 people, all defended by a substantial wall. The round houses were replaced with rectangular houses. Now, normally when you see that kind of shift in archaeology, in the history of a city, you think it's a cultural shift, perhaps indicating a change in population. That may be the case. We may have a second group of people coming in here, but it could just be literally a cultural change. People changed the way they built houses. Now, these houses in the second phase, the rectangular ones, were constructed of mud brick, but organized around rectangular courtyards. They didn't just have mud floors, they had gypsum floors, and their plastered walls were often painted red. We don't know much about the interiors. Reed mats are the only certain furnishing that we have. And there is evidence that sheep and goats were domesticated by this period, if not earlier, as previously mentioned. From around 7000 BC, there's evidence of what has long been thought of as ancestor cult at Jericho. Under the floors of the rectangular houses, archaeologists found burials that represent the need to commemorate family members within this community, possibly also to claim household ownership through ancestral display, meaning that what we have here is, well, property rights, people asserting their property rights over their house. But these also give us the first portraits in human art. Some of these burials are of bodies that were intact, but others were headless, and the heads were treated and kept separate, similarly to those at Çatalhöyük, but with some key differences. The head was removed from the body and the flesh was stripped. Then facial features were built up in modeled plaster on each skull. Pieces of shell were set into the eye sockets, presumably because their white color mimicked the whites of eyes. In some examples, the skull was decorated with red and black paint, we think to copy personal characteristics such as hair or mustaches. Now, most of the skulls are of adult men, but some were from women and children as well. Here's the interesting thing. They excarnated these skulls, that is, stripped the flesh, plastered the features, painted them to look lifelike and apparently individualized, that is, their portraits, and then they buried them under the floors of the houses. They're not on display anywhere. So they aren't actually portraits that anybody's going to look at. Now, a minority of scholars view the skulls as trophies taken from enemies. That is, that they assert the power of the community or of this family. But most, and I agree with the second group, see them as evidence of ancestor worship. Ancestor worship is common among extended families and farming societies as it connects the family to the land and it gives them some authority for ownership. The selection of particular individuals to commemorate in this fashion may have had more to do with the ongoing relationships of the living to specific deceased family, perhaps an attempt to gain some sort of advantage from the deceased, such as acquiring their particular skill or prowess in some activity. In other words, we have a lot of adult male heads, and we think that those represent the elite adult males who were the heads of the household in a previous generation. They pass on, and by honoring them, the existing generation reinforces their position. But some of the women and children may have married into the family, and so they are important for continuing an extended family relationship for these homeowners, if we can call them that. Alternately, some scholars think that the treatment of bones here at Jericho could represent concerns over the potentially malignant activities of ghosts. That means that these creations, these skull portraits, might have been meant to placate angry spirits. I don't see a lot of evidence of that. I think that ancestor worship is the most likely reason for this practice, given its prevalence in the region at later periods, along with the evocative evidence, not just evocative, almost exactly parallel evidence as Çatalhöyük, also in the Neolithic. Of course, we may never know the full meaning of skull treatments in the early Near Eastern Neolithic. Most likely it was associated with identity, memory, and the particular attributes of the deceased. There's a break in occupation at Jericho of about 700 years following the Neolithic abandonment of about 4000 BC. I have to tell you that the city is re-inhabited about 3300 by a group here in the early Bronze Age, but we don't know anything about this period at Jericho. Because the city is abandoned, there is no evidence. We don't know why it was abandoned in 4000 BC. We don't know if there was an attack. And we don't know anything about the people that come in the Bronze Age and their relationship to the Neolithic people. They could be a later phase of the same society, or the same civilization. They could be a completely different one. We really can't tell. And we don't have the evidence from the remains that tells us completely the DNA of these individuals. And culturally, they're so different that we don't see cultural development that would tell us that. Throughout the Bronze Age at Jericho, from about 3300 BC, the walled town on the site was continuously occupied until, using Kathleen Kenyon's date, about 1580 BC, when the settlement was destroyed. Now, about that destruction. This is the reason for Jericho's fame, the destruction conventionally dated to 1580 BC, the final destruction of the city, and the story of Joshua. It's a great story that demonstrates two key things about the site. Number one, its long association with walls, and number two, that it was central to any attempts to control this region. In fact, Jericho was the first city Joshua attacked when he came into the area. But why listen to me when the King James Version of the book of Joshua can speak on it? Joshua 6, verses 1 through 5 and 20 tells us, "Now Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horns, and ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall ascend up, every man straight before him. And so the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city." The archaeological remains of this final period reveal some very intriguing details that seem to support the account of the destruction of the city in Joshua. Now, I have to tell you, this is a debated point. Different excavators have come to different conclusions. As I said, Kathleen Kenyon dated this period to about 1580 BC. Later excavators have dated it to about 1400 BC. And there's a debate about whether either of these dates is appropriate to the time of Joshua. Here's what I think. I think this is the destruction that is, in fact, described in the book of Joshua, but that doesn't mean it has to be contemporary. Let's think for a minute about, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Homer, the Greek poet, writing about 725 BC, is describing the end of the Trojan War, a war that was over in 1177 BC. a date that we know pretty well now. And so he's describing something that passed down through oral tradition and was only really written down later on. That, I think, could be the pattern here. We have the destruction, but the writing of the book of Joshua doesn't have to be contemporary with it. It could, in fact, have occurred later as this memory was kept by the people here. Now, about the evidence of that destruction. When this destruction occurred, whether it's 1400 or 1580 BC, when the houses were burned, they still contained stores of grain, arguing, I think, against a long siege, or that the inhabitants were able to take their food with them when they escaped. And the upper mud brick part of the wall, which measured about 12 feet in height, was found in some areas collapsed. So, when we look at the later ruins of Jericho, it's entirely possible that we're seeing a city destroyed by a siege of only 7 days by a group determined to control this valuable location, or to remove an impediment to their travel through the region, which Jericho once dominated. The conquest of Jericho, therefore, may have been less to take over the spot than to clear it. One can't help but wonder whether the fact that they never occupied the site again is related to the prohibition against doing so found in the book of Joshua. Here, verse 17 on. And the city shall be accursed, even it, and all that are therein to the Lord. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. It's interesting that the biblical account has a ritual prohibition against occupying the city. Now, such things occurred in antiquity in a number of cultures. For example, when the Romans finally took Carthage in 146 BC, they did not, as many people believe, sow the fields with salt, but they did ritually curse the site. And they didn't move back in there for another 100 years. There is, and probably always will be, a debate among archaeologists about how closely the remains of Jericho and its final destruction do or do not conform to the biblical account. Given that some of the arguments are built on faith, it seems to me that there's no way to counter them. But I think we can all agree that nothing in the remains as we have them disputes the account in the book of Joshua. And that may be the best we can hope for, given the extreme age and poor condition of the city's ruins. Two elements from Jericho, however, are not debatable. They are notable in the history of cities. The first is the construction of ritual spaces and their importance in defining the community. Here, the watchtower, which, as I said, I believe is a ritual space, whether it's an observation tower or a temple platform, I think it was used for religious purposes. We saw this same idea about religious spaces defining the community in a smaller scale at Çatalhöyük, but we'll see closer correspondences between Jericho and later developments at the next city in our course, Uruk. Uruk also reflects the second key element found at Jericho, the pattern of a city defined by its great walls and the critical role of communal labor and long-range trade in creating that urban environment. From this point on in human history, we see the almost invariable use of walls to define cities, often to defend from external threats, whether human or environmental. But sometimes, and this is a very intriguing idea, to control the population within. So as we look ahead at cities that are walled, we'll ask ourselves that question continually. Are these walls meant to keep somebody out, or are they meant to keep somebody in?